is Deeana Klepper, and I get to introduce the first panel. Let me tell you a little bit about how this is going to work. We have 3 speakers. Each speaker will talk for about half an hour. We're going to have about 5 or so minutes after each individual paper for you to ask questions specific to that paper, and then we'll have time for a longer conversation afterward, bringing the 3 papers together. And if you just walked in and didn't hear, unfortunately, Alicia Russ-Fishbane had to withdraw, isn't here today, and so we have just 3 papers coming up. So our first speaker is Jason Welle from Boston College, who is an assistant professor of comparative theology. He holds a PhD from Georgetown University and previously taught and served as director of studies at the Pontifical Institute for Arabic and Islamic Studies in Rome. His research interests focus on Muslim-Christian relations, particularly in the medieval period, on Islamic mysticism, and on the Franciscan intellectual tradition. And he'll be talking today on Nishapur yields a seminal plan. l-Ḥasan compares the Adyān. Welcome.
I'd like to start by thanking Jonathan for his work in organizing this conference and for accepting this paper despite its very campy title. You know, our medieval Muslim brothers and sisters loved Sajā. You know, you've got these wonderful titles. Tukhfat an-Nazar fi Gharaib al-Amsar. I like to get rhymey with my titles too. So. I'd also like to thank you all for being here and choosing this panel instead of watching Caitlin Clark. Although I must admit I respond to your decision with confusion. At least those who are following the panel online can have one other window open at the same time. So I suppose I respond to this with the same way that I respond to many blessings God has given me, with awe and confusion and a shrug of the shoulders, and then moving forward. So, Nishapur yields a seminal plan. l-Ḥasan compares the Adyān. The work of l-Ḥasan al-Amari to compare different religions precedes many better-known Muslim writings on the subject. He died in the Gregorian year 992. But despite the systematic nature of al-Amari's text, and despite the widespread attention paid to his philosophical texts, his Kitab al-A'lam bi Manaqib al-Islam remains little studied. So I'm going to be focusing today on his methodology for comparing different religious groups in that text. Relatively little is known about the life of al-Amari. He was born in Khorasan in the early 10th century, Gregorian, and spent most of his life in Persia, although he visited Baghdad at least twice. In his youth, he studied with the aged polymath and philosopher Abu Zayd Ahmad al-Balkhi, which accounts for his eclectic approach to learning and for the diversity of his intellectual interests, as well as his concern to harmonize his philosophy with Islam. And this was a preoccupying marker of his intellectual output. He spent at least the last 12 years of his life in his native Khorasan and utilized the Seminal library there, the same library that Ibn Sina would later use for much of his work. Al-Amari likely wrote some 30 books and is best known for his philosophical works, which leaves other elements of his intellectual production understudied, including the text I plan to discuss today. The intersection of Aristotelian Neoplatonic metaphysics seems to have greatly influenced him. I mean, just to make a broad comment about his philosophical interests, that's the world we're moving toward, and his influence ends up being eclipsed by Ibn Sina, just one generation later, even though al-Amari was known during his lifetime as the philosopher of Nishapur. So it's common to portray him first and foremost as a philosopher, but we see in this text a person in whose milieu religious pluralism was more real than it seems to have been in many places around the realm. Al-Amari authored at least 3 works on comparative religion, although only one of them survives for us to read. And fortunately, that is the one that is most comprehensive in its scope. Al-Amari argues both for the compatibility of Islamic knowledge and secular knowledge, and for the superiority of Islam over the 5 other religions indicated in Quran chapter 2, chapter 22, verse 17. And that text is on your handout. I hope everyone has this. The front side of the handout we don't need for the presentation. It's just some bibliographical information for you in the future in case you're interested in it. But the texts I'd like to look at are on the back side of the handout. So if you look now at passage 1, in the middle of passage 1, I placed in italics this Quranic verse that Al-Amari uses and that many Muslims engaged in this project were using to describe the different religions that they were going to consider. And those who believe, the mu'minun, obviously the Muslims, those who practice Judaism, the Sabians, whoever they are, the Christians, the Magians, whoever they are, and the polytheists. Truly God will judge between them on the day of resurrection. This verse provides the primary point of departure for Al-Amari, and because it's only really in the generations after him that other thinkers would start to consider other Muslim thinkers outside, would start to think about religious groups outside the ones named here. For example, the traditions of India, for example, that Al-Biruni and Al-Shahrastani will talk about in a more developed analysis. We don't have that yet here. He largely sticks to the groups in this verse and dedicates the most space to Christianity, particularly in frequent mention of Christian monasticism. Al-Amari attempts to demonstrate the superiority of Islam over these other religions with individual chapters discussing beliefs, ritual practices, government, social relations, and scholarship. This work was not highly influential. It survives only in 1 manuscript copy, so it presumably did not enjoy great diffusion. It was not cited frequently, although it was often numbered among the books that he had written. But it doesn't seem that many people had actually read the book. And perhaps one reason for the lack of influence in this text might be its relatively ironic tone. It's not as sharply polemical as many other texts from the period. Al-Amari's assertions about philosophy as the highest form of knowledge are consistent with his texts elsewhere, although he knows that this position arouses no little opposition among Muslims. And I'm quoting here, "The mass of people oppose philosophy and refuse to pay attention to it, not because it is forbidden to them, but because with respect to philosophy, they are like bleary-eyed persons facing the sun, or facing the solar eclipse, as whatever the case may be." I mean, he's living in the controversy between the relative value of philosophical knowledge and revealed knowledge, and this only becomes hotter in the generations after his passing. One sees this conviction in his writings throughout, and he foregrounds it near the end of this book when he notes 4 specious arguments against the truth of Islam. Al-Amari frames these specious arguments anonymously, and each of them is at base philosophical in its character. Islam could not be the true religion because the true religion would be a religion of mercy, and Islam is a religion of the sword. Islam could not be the true religion due to its internal divisions and the mutual hatred among Muslims. I mean, he takes some of these really common trope arguments and dismisses them philosophically in the conclusion to this work once he has completed his comparison. The editor of this text, Ahmed Abdelhamid Hurab, extols the singular genius of al-Amiri, which probably should not surprise any of us, given our predilection for hero narratives about the absolute scholarly vacuum and desperate necessity of whatever project it is that we decide to undertake. The editor of this work is certainly writes in that vein, noting that what makes al-Amiri distinctive is his programmatic endeavor, his muhawala manhajiyya, in that he attempts to delineate the foundations for his method very clearly before beginning his comparison. Therefore, although perhaps the Irenic tone of this work might have hindered its diffusion, the work's systematic character in terms of articulation of method probably sets it alongside or above better known texts from the period. So we'll look at some examples from the text shortly. Nearly all of the scholarly writing on this book has focused on the first half of the book relating to its philosophical themes. And there, if you take your handout, I gave you an outline of this text at the top. The Prolegomena and the first three sections have already been translated into English, but none of that has to do with any of the other religions. That's all the debate. His taxonomy of the different sciences, sacred and secular, the difference between revealed knowledge and philosophical knowledge. So all of that is simply providing a theoretical framework for what kind of knowledge is valued, what sorts of studies should be pursued, and then from section 4 and following is actually the comparative project, and the texts we'll look at come from that section. So if we look now at the first passage there. The axis of religion is the nexus of doctrines, acts of worship, social transactions, and censures. Censures in the sense of punishments for one who has done wrong. It is not a leap for a rational person to know, with the least bit of reasoning, that not one of the 6 religions that have territories and kingdoms, so religions that have governed space, that occupy significant communities in their political life, we could say. Not one of the 6 religions that have territories and kingdoms, and they are mentioned in God's statement, the verse already cited, and those who believe, those who practice Judaism, the Sabians, the Christians, the Magians, the polytheists, truly God will judge between them on the day of resurrection. Not one of the 6 religions exists without doctrine about something that his striving pursues, without a program of acts of worship that obligates obedience, without laying down social transactions that give order to their lives, and without patterns for censures by which one is protected from calamities and evils. And it's not a leap for the rational person to know that it is obligatory for him to actualize a preponderance of what he prefers from among these 4 areas over that which he scorns from among them, not by account of imitating the pious ancestors, but rather by the requisite of pure reason, aql sarih. So this text synthesizes 3 key elements, I would say, of al-Amiri's method in this book. First, the division between doctrines, acts of worship, social transactions, mu'amalat, searching for a word to translate that, but I think most of us know what it is, and censures. These are the 4 primary nodes that he's going to use for comparison, and he will subdivide each of them, but they provide the overall structural logic for the book, and you can see that in the outline above. Section 5 is about doctrine, section 6 is about ibadat, section 7 is going to be about mu'amalat, and section 8 will ultimately be about the censures. So this is how the structure he has provided to frame his argument. The second element, he delineates the religions he's going to look at according to the Quranic text. He allows the sacred text to govern the way he frames things. Third, he indicates that he will employ a philosophical method, an aqli rather than a naqli evaluation. This line at the end of passage number 1 where he says, instead of merely imitating the pious ancestors, taqlid, he wants to perform his comparison not based on how far all of the others have strayed from what was revealed to them, but on some supposedly objective philosophical grounds that are outside that will enable us to set the teachings and practices of these traditions in a rational way across from each other and compare them. So this claim about using pure reason is a strong claim here. And I can note that when he says pure reason, he doesn't indicate merely abstract reason. The sorts of things that would fall under pure reason, as he's using it here, include religious practices like which style of prayer works better in cultivating your devotion. How much charity ought you give? So it's not merely abstract arguments about the existence and nature of God and God's attributes, etc. What falls under aqli here includes a knowledge that we would call very concrete, very practical. Al-Amri then continues by subdividing each of these 4 areas, claiming that within each of these 4 main areas there is an axis within it. So the axis of doctrinal matters consists in 5 pillars: faith in God, in God's angels, in God's books, in God's messengers, and the last day. The axis of acts of worship consists in 5 pillars: spiritual acts like canonical prayer, corporal acts like fasting, monetary acts like almsgiving, civic acts like jihad, and acts that share in them like the major pilgrimage. I won't go through all of them for the other groups, but he denotes 5 for each of the 4 main headings, so that he comes to have a total of 20 pillars. And that's how we arrive at the second text on the handout. It has become evident that the 6 religions have primary pillars. Their number reaches 20, 5 under each of the 4 main headings. It is obligatory for everyone who wants to be knowledgeable of the superiority of the righteous community, the Millah Hanifiyya, over the others, that one by one he measure them by evaluating what they contain of the pillars, evaluating a counterpart from the Millah Hanifiyya against what is arranged under the other religions, and make his intellect assess the distinction between the nobler and the ignoble, in order to arrive by means of this to the rank of the reflective, and to be granted certainty that he has acquired their privilege of divine grace in full measure. So, Al-Amri throughout the text continually returns to this notion of a righteous community, the Millah Hanifiyya. And when he does that, he's never speaking about a general Hanifi religion that also perhaps would incorporate monotheists in general, Jews, Christians, etc. He always uses this term to refer to Muslims. It's a catchphrase for the Muslim community and only for them. It's not an ecumenical notion. But more important to this short passage is his usage of the idea of measurement. He draws upon the verbal rut, qaf, ya, sin, known to jurists as the foundation for analogical reasoning, qiyas, in which a jurist attempts to derive a ruling for a case that lacks explicit textual precedent in the Quran or in the Sunnah. But Al-Amr uses the term, and it's clearer even in other passages in his book, in the etymological sense of qiyas as measurement, not simply in the mode of analogy, the way many of us might instinctively think about it. He proposes a concrete evaluation, both qualitative and quantitative, of the relative merits of 2 or more things. And A binary that he frequently comes back to in his comparison is, he'll talk about the kamiyya and the kayfiyya, the quantitative and the qualitative element of his comparison. And shortly after this passage, he expands by clarifying the correct way to perform this measuring. So one thing that he says explicitly, proper comparisons should only be made between things of the same genus. I don't take a genus from your religion and compare it to the species of my religion, or the genus from mine and compare it to the species of yours. Like should be compared to like, whichever two religions it is that we're talking about. He writes, one does not attend to the nobler thing and then measure it against the baser thing that accompanies it, and one does not attend to the root of one thing, asl, and compare it to the branch, far, of the other. So this interest in the genus species question governs what his stated method will be. He further insists that in comparison, a scholar should not attend to what is lacking in one case, though this absence is not observed in the totality of cases, and then attribute this lack to the whole of its class. This is his way of expressing the dilemma, making a part stand for the whole. I notice the absence of some positive characteristic I want to see in this part of a religion, and I try and project it onto the whole. He says, no, you can't do that. He explicitly articulates the part-whole problem in comparison and says you can't note one absence here and pretend that it stands for an overall absence within that tradition. And one must credit him here for the soundness of his stated principles. Compare things of like status in their traditions. Don't mistake parts for wholes. And if I might push his reasoning on the part-whole question a little bit further, don't compare one religion's ideal to the other's reality. He sees the injustice of this. Now, I emphasize that these are his stated principles. He occasionally falls away from them. For example, I'll throw in comments that if a foreign king were to conquer the Muslims, he would find that not one of them ever neglects the Friday prayer, whereas the Christians have completely abandoned their practice of baptism, and the Jews have come to permit transgression of the Sabbath. So he's got his stated principles of how the comparison should be done, and I just want to note that they are articulated in advance and striking in their soundness, even if their exercise is inconsistent. Al-Amari front-loads the primacy of doctrine in his comparison of these traditions, and this is seen in the third passage on the handout. The most meritorious kinds of religious pillars are the 5 pillars of doctrinal matters. They are counted within the domain of ilm, whereas the other kinds are counted within the domain of practice, amal. There is no doubt that the relation of knowledge to practice is analogous to the relation of cause to effect, or to the relation of beginning to completion. When the cause of something is corrupted and when its initiation is deficient, proper functioning will not cling to it forever. When the completion of something does not work, its beginning had most certainly clung to imperfection. A particular function of doctrine in Al-Amari's conception is the preservation of justice. Whereas other theorists of the virtues in this period frame justice as the proper equilibrium between the other cardinal virtues, Al-Amari frames justice strongly in relation to doctrine, that once a person becomes warped in doctrine, that person loses the attribute of justice and then now is seemingly destined to become debauched in whatever element of practice it is that we're talking about, whether it's the practice of acts of worship, practice of social transactions, practice of censures. Once my doctrine goes astray, I fall out of justice and am certain to wander away in the particulars. I will admit to you that when I chose Al-Amri's Al-I'lam for this presentation, I had anticipated that in the text, having looked at his methodology, that he would provide some more explicit ranking of religions. I mean, based on the methodological principles he sets forth, Islam emerges as the most meritorious religion by any metric. But his evaluation of the other 5 religions in relationship to each other remains much more elusive. To illustrate this, I could take one example from the religions of India. He harshly condemns Indian ascetics that burn bodies or float corpses down the river. Now, by his metric, in order to be meritorious, acts of worship must find a moderate path between severity and laxity, and they must promote life in this world and life in the world to come. So if we talk about the practice of burning a dead body or of floating a dead body down the river, here these practices don't even rate on the scale we're using to evaluate relative merits. It's like they're not even seeking the same goals that Al-Amri would ascribe to the 6 religions identified in that Quranic verse. So here we can say, as we weigh the religions against each other, or here are nominally religious people who aren't even striving for the goals that a religious person ought to strive for. But then when we think about the religions that are named in this Quranic verse, well, how do we weigh the Christians and the Jews against each other, or the Christians and the Zoroastrians against each other? He's surprisingly elusive on this point, and it's an element that I admit to you I found myself disappointed in the text. That Islam is always portrayed as the moderate path, in terms of the Aristotelian golden mean, a constant rhetorical device where 1 or 2 religions are set up on the side of severity as we look at a spectrum. Another one is set up over here on the side of laxity as we look at a spectrum. And of course, Islam is the superior one because it finds the middle and most beneficial path. But how do we know whether their severity is worse than their laxity? That kind of ranking is elusive in the text. One could rightly characterize his approach as mechanistic, theoretically, at least insofar as he aspires to measure precisely the merits of these different traditions, even though he doesn't give us in the end, the calculus for how to do it. I'll make one final comment before Diane gives me the crook. A central issue that I see feeding into this text is the question of ambiguity in the intellectual life of believers. I mean, I think about Thomas Bauer's book, A Culture of Ambiguity, looking at the tolerance or non-tolerance in the Islamic tradition for a certain measure of uncertainty within a broader framework of agreement. In these debates about the role of philosophy versus the role of revealed knowledge in the community of believers, what we see in this text is someone who wants to insist that at least how can I put this? Who wants to insist that the superiority of Islam is something that is demonstrable without revealed knowledge. It's demonstrable on other grounds. So for all of the debate within the Ummah about specious arguments that are confusing the masses, and whether the philosophers are greater than the masses. At the very least, we must establish this, that that one can demonstrate rationally the superiority of Islam over other traditions, and any ambiguity or uncertainty in our collective intellectual life does not extend that far. So with that, I thank you. Okay. I can take them. I'm among friends.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question has to do with history or chronology. The evaluation that you presented to us seemed ahistorical. And it strikes me in looking at this Quranic verse that the other 5 religions predate Islam. And I'm curious whether he pays any attention to aspects of chronological development in any of his analysis, or whether he analyzes the doctrines and rituals and censors and so on as he encounters them in his own time without consideration of historical development.
No, that's a great question. No, history really doesn't matter. So in the early part of the book, when he's talking about the Islamic sciences and the importance of the relative value of traditionists and preserving valid transmission of revealed knowledge, in that sense, obviously history is important. But in comparing traditions to each other, how do I evaluate prayer, for example? Some communities pray in ways that involve both standing and prostration. Others only use prostration. Others only stand. And I can demonstrate that it's more beneficial to you to both make prostration and stand, which is what we do. When he's setting things up that way, it does tend to be largely ahistorical. And in that sense, the questions of tahrif don't play an important role in this book, at least, because he's trying to frame his argument on very different grounds.
Thank you so much. I'll try to be brief. 2 questions. One, there is an interesting tension in the first source that you brought that has to do with, on the one hand, Al-Amiri asserts that he wants to assess the value of the different religions rationally and to approach them on his own, by his own aql. But on the other hand, with regards to who are the different religions, he is very strictly traditional. The different religions are known by this Quranic verse, even though one can assume that he knows of other possibilities that are somehow around him. So this is, and I wonder what you think about it. The other question has to do with something probably more general that we can further discuss in this conference, is that one way of comparing different religions and maybe ranking different religions has to do with their ideal type. What Christians aspire to, what Jews aspire to, what Muslims aspire to. Another way of comparing or ranking them has to do with how much the adherents of this religion achieve their ideals. And here one can, you've mentioned it briefly, that what may make Islam better, and actually this goes back to the Quran quite boldly, is that the Mu'minun are the ones who adhere to their ideal relationship, rapport with God, unlike the Jews. who have broken the covenant, who do not fulfill the ideal of religion. And so there is also here the possibility of an interesting tension between comparing the ideals of or the different religions on an ideal level or on a realistic level of
Yeah. Thank you. If I could take the second question first, aside from a couple of throwaway comments where he'll criticize others' reality, he does try to organize things on the level of ideals. So the one passage I didn't get a chance to look at for almsgiving, he compares the Jewish ideal of tithing with a Muslim idea of zakat, and he never makes the argument, yeah, but the Jews don't really tithe. No, he's setting at what ought a person to do in that tradition, and in that regard, he's going to be very harshly critical of Christianity for essentially being anti-humanist in their denial of the importance of the acquisition of property. I lost the first part of the question. Oh, yeah. So mostly he passes over these questions in silence. So for example, the Thabi'un, who are they? He just speaks about them very little. He comes back to the Manichaeans and the Majus very relatively frequently, and is confident. I don't think there's any reason to doubt the identification between Zoroastrians and the Majus in his mind. Who the Thabi'un are is, I think, an open question. But if there's something that confuses me about his analysis, it's that this Quranic verse includes mention of polytheists and how he could frame them within the same general umbrella of religion oriented to certain goals. He passes that over too strangely in silence. I think it's something that if he were to construct the major religions he wants to look at ex nihilo, he would probably exclude them as a matter of principle. But because they're found in this Quranic verse, he needs to include them, and never offers, to my mind, a really coherent explanation for why they belong in the same framework as Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians. So, yeah, the first, it's a question that confuses me as well. Thank you.
Okay. Do we have any images that are going to be up on the screen? Okay. While our speaker gets organized, can I introduce you while you get organized? Sure. Okay. Our next speaker is Barbara Roggema, who teaches History of the Muslim World at the University of Florence in Italy, and is also a research fellow in the ERC project Armenia Entangled, Connectivity and Cultural Encounters in Medieval Eurasia. She specializes in the history of Jewish, Christian, Muslim interaction in the medieval Middle East, with an emphasis on Christian writings in response to Judaism and Islam. Her PhD dissertation was published as The Legend of Sergius Bahira, Eastern Christian Apologetics and Apocalyptic in Response to Islam, which was published in 2009. She co-edited, among other things, the volume Christian-Muslim Relations, A Biographical History, 600 to 900, also that came out in 2009, and The Three Rings, Textual Studies in the Historical Trialogue of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And today she'll be giving a paper entitled Us, Us, and Them, Thoughts on the Truth Hierarchy of Religions in Arab Christian Thought from the 8th to 14th Century.
Okay, let's hope this gets started. The PowerPoint. Should it be already projecting? Yes, okay. There we go. I put this picture of a nice manuscript of a text called Kitab Ustath Rahib, thinking I was going to talk a lot about this text. And then I was so worried about the time that in the end I didn't include a discussion of it. But I thought the image is very nice because you see the table of contents of this theological handbook. And yeah, there's lots of religions to deal with, including for a Christian author having to deal with the various Christian sects. I don't want to put this on timer. I can just stop it, right? And then I can let it go by itself. Oh, it's just sunshine. That's great. Okay. Let's see. In 2011, Professor Jozef van Es published his two-volume work, Der eine und das andere. I'm sure you've seen this book. Beobachtungen an islamischen heresiografischen Texten. The work covers 1,500 pages, which is rather modest for Professor van Es standards, but for us normal people, it is an amazing book. It gives us an incredible insight into the world of medieval Middle Eastern religious diversity. The index of religions, sects, and theological schools is endless. A random page here of the on the slide of the index unsurprisingly reveals that Shiites and Sabians feature very often in heresiographical texts. But what are we to make, for example, of the Sakakiya or the Shimrachiya, however that may be, the Samtiya? As a whole, the work reminds us of the diversity of religious beliefs in the Islamic Middle East. Van Es argues that all these groups were not heresies to be persecuted or to be refuted, but rather confessions which can be understood as proof of a pluralistic structure of the Islamic communities. I guess in English we would say these days Islamicate rather than Islamic. Although this is true in comparison to medieval Europe, in the sense that there were fewer impulses, perhaps, or mechanics to achieve a homogeneous religious landscape, nonetheless, these texts often express judgments about religious others and replies to claims that various groups made. When we fully take in this heterogeneous confessional reality and then look at the wide variety of religious refutations that were written by members of all the major religions and schools of thought, it will not surprise us that apologists who wanted to defend their own community and doctrines were aware of the arguments of a third or a fourth or a fifth religious competitor, besides the most immediate religious other. One of the questions I would like to deal with, I do deal with in my research, is how apologetics really worked from this multi-religious perspective. I try to understand how the many texts in Arabic of religious confrontation form a sort of ongoing conversation over the centuries. To reconstruct and to understand this conversation, I study little-known texts such as debates, disputations, refutations, etc., which I find in various manuscripts, with the aim of uncovering the polyphony of this century-long conversation. When it comes to Christians in the Middle East, it is often assumed that their primary targets is Islam, in the sense that Islam posed the strongest challenge to their belief system, rejecting the central tenets of the Trinity, the incarnation, and the death of Christ by crucifixion. And also because as a community, of course, Christians were subjected to Islamic rule as dhimmis. Much research has been devoted to the ways in which Arabic-speaking Christians experimented with ways to make their faith understandable to Muslims. What needs to be stressed, however, is that Arab Christians were just as well part of that multi-religious world in which they encountered a variety of other faiths. What intrigues me about this question is how the question how they thought about this multiplicity of religions and how they try to understand the historical and doctrinal connections between them, all as part of a complicated set of strategies to uphold the veracity of their own tradition. I would say probably one of the best-known Christian Arabic apologists in the West amongst us here is Theodore Abou-Qurra, the Melkite scholar who lived in the late 8th, early 9th century. I put a slide of this nice book produced by John Lamoureux with selected translations. Of course, there is a lot of work also edited by him in Arabic. And maybe you know that Sasha Treyger has recently argued that the book called The Master and the Discussion of the Master and the Disciple in 43 chapters should also be attributed to Theodore Abou-Qurra. So his corpus is even bigger than we thought. At various points in his works, he comments that in order to fully understand, to fully prove the truth of Chalcedonian orthodoxy, all competing groups should be refuted, both Christian heresies and all other religions. In his treatise on the existence of the Creator and the right religion, he lets a young man come down from the mountains to have him visit pagan star worshippers, Samaritans, Jews, Zoroastrians, Manichaeans, Marcionites, and the followers of Bardaisan. The picture next to Theodore Abou-Qurra here is from a voluminous theological apologetic handbook that is regrettably still unpublished. Here too, we see an interest that goes beyond Christian-Muslim confrontation. There are distinct chapters about dualistic religions, as well as Jews and Dahriya. We just talked about it. How should it be translated? The materialists, atheists, those who believe in the eternity of the world. How are they to be refuted? What we see is the beginning of the tradition of writing extensive apologetic handbooks. The one here on the right, I called it Summary of the Aspects of the Faith, Al-Jami' li Wujuh al-Iman, is about 200 folios, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, 199 folios, yeah. Here we have an even older text, older in the sense of when it was written, not when it was copied, although this is also a very old manuscript, as you can see. This is a text written originally in Greek, but in the early Islamic milieu, probably in Palestine, around the year 700. And it was translated into Arabic very early on, maybe about a century later when the earliest Arabic translations were made. It's called the Questions to Pseudo-Athanasius of Alexandria by Antiochus the Duke. It's very far below, I hope you can see it. The text consists of critical questions about the Christian faith, voiced by a somewhat skeptical Christian, and put to Athanasius of Alexandria, which is obviously an anachronistic attribution because there are many references to Islam in the text. This little passage here, one of those 137 questions, is revealing in that it shows an awareness of how the substance of one's own doctrines is often expressed in response to critique from others. The question highlights that the genuine core of a ritual or idea can become lost when one answers to outsiders. It is telling that Pseudo-Athanasius does not even try to look inwardly for a rationale, in this case about the direction of prayer, because the rationale is here what others want to hear. The passage thus exemplifies the challenges of constructing a coherent defense of the faith in face of simultaneous but conflicting challenges. Even more caution is needed when various separate religious competitors voice the same critique. In a way, we already see that here. The answers are different to Jews and to Muslims, but the question is the same. What is the rationale for Christian worship towards the East? Praying towards the East. It should just be a human invention. From other texts, it became clear that it was not only divergent, but also not based on Christ's own practice. Christ never prayed to the East. So the norm imposed here by Jewish and Christian critics is that one's own ritual practice should be based on that of one's founder. I put founder here between apostrophes because suddenly there's this idea developing that Christ was, as it were, a person with a certain sunnah who should be followed as a model. And this was hard for Christians to explain, that it was not the way it worked for them. There were many other cases where Muslim and Jewish critique overlapped. The accusation of idolatry with regard to the cross and icons, of course, the rejection of the notion of divine sonship and the incarnation, the abandonment of Mosaic law, the preference given to the apostolic beliefs and practices as opposed to Jesus' own way of life, already mentioned. It is well known that this symmetry of polemic was taken up as a challenge by the apologetic writers and was turned around to become a point of critique in the other direction. Jewish-Muslim similarities became a weapon. Instead of allowing Christianity to be seen as the odd one out between the three religions, the early Christian Arabic authors restated that Christianity is the culmination of divine revelation. It was prepared by God via the Jewish scriptures, but the simple monotheism of the Jews has become obsolete after the fulfillment of the prophetic parts of the Hebrew Bible. By pointing out the similarities to Judaism in the Islamic religion, quite a simple answer was found as to how Islam's unrelenting critique of the core of the Christian doctrines could be dismissed. You are like Jews, and you can't grasp our deeper spirituality and knowledge. This is actually a long story, which I can make short, not because it's not worthy of further discussion, but because we have here the specialist on the topic, the next speaker, David Freidenreich, who has written a book called Jewish Muslims, as well as an interesting article on the topic of Eastern Christian accusations to Muslims that they are believing like Jews. Let me just emphasize that we have a major polemical strand here that involves the ranking of religions. Polemical, apologetic arguments were refined and altered over time. They were always a product of trial and error. What I would like to show here is that within the corpus of Arabic Christian texts, there is a wider variety of approaches to Judaism and Islam, which involves questions of distance and similarity as well. I would like to illustrate this by looking at one specific example at first, a little study text, which is called the Book of the Tower. Here, a picture of the edited and published sections 1 and 2. Also, number 3 has appeared, and we're still waiting for the whole rest of the 7 parts of this book. There's been a huge amount of confusion about what this book really, where it really comes from, and for a long time it was attributed to the 14th century to an author called Mari ibn Sulaiman, and I think there's now scholarly consensus that this should be attributed to Amr ibn Matta al-Tirhani from North Mesopotamia, and that it belongs to the 11th century, late 10th, early 11th century. It comes from the East Syrian community. Although it's long been known, it's only recently received the properly scholarly attention. What's most important is that we have this edition now and translation of 3 out of the 7 parts. The text claims to represent an edifice, a tower, constructed by means of the essence of the East Syrian Christian forms of belief. It's like a bulwark. As with many of such large handbooks, it contains a wealth of ideas about competing religious communities and their interrelations. I would like to focus on two passages and look at the creative ways in which he compares Judaism and Islam. First, I copied a section of a long chapter that Ahmad has about circumcision. It's kind of long, and I tried to summarize it a little bit, shorten it a bit with the ... but I think the most important things are here. Then, there were those sons of Ismail who were born in the land of Tihama. They began circumcising their daughters without divine command, nor did they do so in order to set themselves apart from their neighbors or to prevent intermarriage with people of base lineage. When the religion of Islam emerged among them, the custom of circumcising daughters along with sons during the time between their birth and puberty became established as a mandatory commandment and one of the foundations of their religion. The second circumcision, that of girls, was something added to God's command to Abraham, or better put, something contradicting the earlier covenant. Many years went by until eventually all the adherents of this religion became circumcised. Then the children of Abraham from Keturah, that's to say the Turks, appeared in the lands of the east, multiplied and grew strong. They strayed from the true path and rejected circumcision. As a result, the law of Islam got modified, and they no longer circumcise males or females. Those among them who only now convert to Islam are circumcised, but others remain in their uncircumcised state as they were created. Thus, the Muslims became identical to their neighbors among the nations, and family ties were established among them. There was no longer a need to have a sign by which one would be differentiated from the others, and the lineage of the Arab Muslims became intertwined and mixed with that of other nations. Superiority is now achieved through obedience. The Jewish pride in being circumcised, distinguished, and having a superior lineage has dwindled. They have become humiliated, and divine anger with them has become evident. Their circumcision did not help them when they refused to believe in Christ, and their pride was given to others. The slave became equal to someone who was completely free, and the earlier prophecies concerning the union of nations and peoples came true, and purity is attained by the one who repents. The first part of Amr ibn Matta's discussion here tells us little else, the part that precedes what I'm citing here, contains little else than the average early Christian apologetic text about Judaism. The Jews have no grounds to insist on it, and as something still commanded by God, something of eternal validity and intrinsically positive. Circumcision only served the Jews during a time when the chosen people needed a mark of distinction. Paul of Tarsus' decision not to demand this from Christians, but not forbidding it either, is telling. And yet God clearly blessed the Christians and took away the blessing of the Jewish community. One new argument, as far as I can see, is the reference to female circumcision already in the earlier part. The fact that it was not commanded is an additional sign that Jewish circumcision was neither for reasons of kinship originally, nor for purity, nor for happiness and grace. Because in those cases, if this had been the case, women would have been deserving it too. Obviously, these points become harder to argue persuasively at a time when Christians saw themselves living under rulers and next to neighbors who also believed God requires the cutting of the foreskin. Our author, however, tries to turn every challenge to the consistency of his own belief system into a positive. We will see how, by looking at the final passages of the chapter, let's see. How he makes the comparison with Islam and says that the roots of the Islamic circumcision lie in pre-Islamic customs amongst the Arabs, the people of the Tihama, as we saw, who were already doing this before the revelation of Islam. This clashes with claims Muslims might make as to Christians who abandon the law and Muhammad's need to then revive it. Amr ibn Matta makes it clear that the origin lies in the local custom, not in the divine commandment. What helps him to stress the relevance of the local historical background is the fact that girls are circumcised too, since this is not in the Quran. This detail also preempts any counter-critique that he first argued circumcision for both sexes might be a sign of kinship and grace. Point. A further indication of discontinuity with the Jewish tradition is the different timing of the operation. It just has to happen between birth and puberty. His most interesting point comes at the end. Since the work is dated to the late 10th or probably 11th century, the context in which he writes is, of course, the time of the rise of the Seljuks, who rose to power in the first half of the 11th century. Amr ibn Matta adduces the flexibility of Islamic law and the reality of non-circumcision among Muslims to cast this back at the claims of the Jews in such a way that the image of the Jews as a humiliated people will still stand. He uses the historical milieu of the Islamic world to underscore that the Christian claim about the universality of the Christian faith and its spread around all nations and all around the world will also keep its validity. He stresses the communality of Islam and Christianity in both insisting that piety is the measure that God uses to judge people. He might even be alluding to the Quranic verse 49:13, "We have made you into nations and tribes, that you know each other. Verily, the most honorable of you with God is the most pious." In other words, at the end of this passage, we see a Christian author undermining a point of Jewish-Christian agreement in opposition to Christianity by completely transforming the issue to a claim of Christian-Muslim similarity in opposition to Judaism. Both communities seem to indicate that they like mixing with other peoples and that they don't think that there's anything essential in circumcision. In this regard, Amr ibn Matta fits in a specific tradition of Christian Arabic apologetic thinking. Several parts of his enormous Book of the Tower form examples. In Book 2, there is another chapter, a chapter that narrates the life of Christ to prove that he is the Messiah and that he was born from the Virgin. Proof texts from the Hebrew Bible are summarized. He writes this in Saj, in rhyme prose. It almost sounds Quranic sometimes. While the miraculous deeds and events culminate in a description of the apostles embarking on their universal mission to convert the world to Christianity. Two intriguing paragraphs follow. The land of the Tihama and the Hijaz were devoid of Christian missionaries because the apostles stopped at Najran, refraining from going further. They were occupied with the kings of Kinda and the sultans of Yemen, who wore crowns and collars and whose power was glorious and well known. And then the master of the law of Islam appeared, Muhammad, son of Abdallah the Arab, peace be upon him. And he called its people to the believing God and drew them to him through obedience and force. He eradicated the idols of the time of ignorance and lowered the banners of error. He renewed the places of worship as houses for prayer, and the commandments for fasting and charity were instituted. He bore witness to the advent of Christ and confirmed the authority of the Word and the Spirit. He confirmed his coming into this world from a pure, immaculate virgin, and his ascent to heaven alive and eternal, without any doubt. And the wretched, contrary Jews stuck to obstinacy and denial. You know that maybe you know the very famous Italian novel, which is called Christ Stopped at Eboli, written in 1945 by Carlo Levi. It's about a man who's sent on a mission to southern Italy and to the area of Basilicata, and the people are very rustic. They call themselves donkeys, and they say, we're donkeys because Christ never made it here to Basilicata. He stopped at Eboli, just north of here. And this is what I was thinking of when I see that the apostles stopped at Najran. They never made it further into the Arabian Peninsula, and therefore the Arabs in the Central Arabian Peninsula were left with their simple forms of life, later to be brought to monotheism by Muhammad. So here's Muhammad's role in the divine plan. Muhammad clearly brought nothing to his people that is not in agreement with Christianity. In the last few lines, Amr ibn Matta still mentions the Quran's approval of the gospel, its praise of priests and monks, its mention of all of Christ's miracles. And then the last line, the hopeless situation of the contrary Jews. We obviously see a very different Islam here compared to the earlier passages, the earlier texts I referred to, which like to see Judaism and Islam as the same phenomenon, or almost the same phenomenon. Islam is supportive of Christians and their faith. If Muslims are not entirely open to this, open to Christianity, then it is because they come from this very simplistic, rustic background. This, however, does not mean that Christianity cannot be found in the Quran. Only one has to read the text very closely. Amr ibn Matta was certainly not the only one to claim this. There's a whole series of texts that portray Islam as about 1 inch removed from the truth of Christianity. There's not enough time to go through many other examples of this, but I just wanted to show you one. This is also interesting because it's been published not so long ago. Again, an enormous apologetic handbook, which is entitled The Explanation of the Nicene Creed. It's really the kind of thing that makes you so excited, no? When you read that title, it's like, wow, I'm going to read that. 3 volumes on the Nicene Creed. But it's actually a really fascinating text. I can highly recommend it, because what does the author do? Just reviews many, many aspects of Christianity that are undoubtedly true for various reasons, but every single detail is also proven by means of the text of the Quran. So, details of Christ's life, or the truth of certain predictions of the Hebrew Bible, the virgin birth, etc. We see this indicated. This is just a little example I have here. Proofs for the divine incarnation, long chapter, it goes on and on. The various proof texts of the Hebrew Bible, Jeremiah said, the prophet Daniel said, and it just goes on. And then it says, قَوْلَهُ تَعَالَى Ya Maryam, etc. Then it just follows. It's only the modern editor who has inserted this line saying testimonies from the Quran, because for the author it's a continuous thing. It just belongs together. The Quran points backwards where the Hebrew Bible points forward, but it all points to the same thing. Now, this is one example. There's many other texts. By chance, these are 2 East Syrian texts, but the same strand of apologetics can be found with other Eastern Christian communities that try to show Islam extremely close to Christianity. Okay, in a very simple way, I wanted to summarize this, is that Christianity could be seen as having been challenged by Jewish and Islamic arguments from both sides, with some different arguments, but then also the weight of their actual similarities. I think Chava Lazarus Jaffe, in her nice book about Islam and medieval Bible criticism, talks about how the Christians put themselves in a difficult position by claiming that they had abrogated Judaism, but there was no way that Christianity could ever be abrogated. I think she called it something like Christianity being sandwiched or something. if I'm not mistaken. I should have looked up the reference. I only think about this now. But here we see a kind of sandwiched Christianity. And this apologetic challenge is what we have already talked about. Well, what happened is that in the worldview that is projected by these Christian sources, especially in the early centuries, is that the pyramid should be upside down, Judaism continues to be at the bottom, and Islam is very similar, but nevertheless also down there, while Christianity represents the culmination of revelation. That's all very fine. But then when we look at the text like the Nicene Creed, the commentary on the Nicene Creed, and the Book of the Tower, and various other examples, it becomes different. I could swap this pyramid just around and say, okay, now we have the upside-down pyramid with Islam and Christianity on top and Judaism at the bottom. But it's actually even a little bit different, I think, because what these texts are trying to tell us is that Christianity is so similar to Islam. Well, actually, Islam is so similar to us that we should really be forming one community. That's not said openly, but there's, together with the kind of examples I'm giving here, there is the continuous hammering at the fact that Christians are not mushrikun. So anything that could be considered critical of Christians is explained away, and all the positive notions of Christianity in the Quran are emphasized. This comes together with the continuous kind of negative attitude to the Jews. There is no way that this kind of inclusive discourse that is open to the kind of communalities between Islam and Christianity is then extended to focus on any similarity with the Jews. And just as we've seen this in the Book of the Tower, the same happens in the Nicene Creed, that it's not just about the negative image of the Jews that's being projected, it also always comes in the end in a very bland and simplistic way. You might say, well, that's not necessarily also polemic, it's maybe more the kind of rephrasing of traditional ideas, but it's still striking that rather than having a pyramid, as we had in the beginning, I mean the one on the right, now we have still Christianity on top, but Islam is pulled on top as well. And there should be just a sense of communality. I thought I had the time running here, and I actually don't. So I wanted to say one more thing, but maybe it's too long. Okay, I'm sorry. What happened to all those other sects? Were they not important? I said Theodore Bakura had some comments, and Jamia Wujuh Haliman. Well, I thought about this also because of Al-Amri. What about other religious communities? Well, in many of the texts that I've worked on, there's the set of 3 religions that occur all the time: Marcionites, Bardaisanites, and Manichaeans. They are almost like a holy trinity of error. And they, of course, have somewhat to do with each other in the history of the Middle East, but are not necessarily related religions. But they keep on coming up as a little triad that functions as a lightning rod for the critique in the Quran of mushrikun. The Christians were annoyed that they were being called mushrikun, and they kept on pointing to these 3 particular sects to indicate that they are actually the ones to whom this polemic is addressed. They're not bringing up Sabians or pagans or whatever. No, the mushrikun are those 3. I have a lot more to say about that, but I think it's better to stop because I've spoken too long, just to bring us back to the pluralistic picture that I think is very interesting. Thank you.
Just a kind of quick clarifying question. When you mentioned this concept of Jesus's sunnah, were you referring to that as a kind of Christian Arab attempt to sort of portray Christianity and Islam as very, very close, meaning that this concept of the Sunnah of Jesus was something that Arab Christians kind of took from their Muslim neighbors?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think as a term, it definitely is used for the life of Christ in my old manuscripts, let's say the manuscripts that I used from the 9th century. In the 9th century, it was not so common yet for people to refer to the Sunnah of Muhammad, no? People said it took longer for the whole idea of the Sunnism to form. So it could be that Sunnah, for just as a term for way of life, was already common earlier on amongst Arab Christians. But that's just a matter of terminology. But the whole idea that a religion is that which forms as a set of rules around a founder, that is an idea that's projected mostly by Jewish and Muslim apologists, and it's not necessarily something that makes so much sense for Christians, but they were kind of forced to answer that because there was always the question like, why do you do the Eucharist? Christ never did something like that. Why do you pray to the East? Christ never did anything like that. So there's this, it's kind of set as a criterion for the true faith that you follow the example of your model, your prophet, or your God incarnate, or whoever it might be. But yeah, the Christians had a lot of explaining to do why they didn't have that proper sunnah in that respect. It was not just the fact that they didn't follow his sunnah, but it's also the fact that if he had a sunnah, it would have been very close to what the Jews do. And how come that you abandon that? And that's where the whole polemic starts about the Apostle Paul, that basically he's the creator of Christianity, and he had no authority to do so. And that becomes a very strong strand of polemic. This is also why I think I'm talking now all from inside the mind of these Christians, but it's ridiculous to think that you have a book which is a commentary on the Nicene Creed full of Quran citations that like we're basically believing exactly the same thing. If you take a step back and see what Muslims were writing at that time about Christianity, that they wouldn't have recognized any of that in it. And it's so far from what they themselves believed. So it's like an attempt at dialogue that bounces off a completely different reality. This is why I think it's just all a construct, but clearly one that was successful amongst Christians, because I found even texts from the 17th century, 18th century, which still claim the same. They cite the same verses of the Quran and indicate that if you read the Quran well, it's basically a Christian document. That was credible to people, I guess.
Thank you. We'll get more questions later.
Okay. This was in here, right? For whoever needs.
Thanks. Okay, we have one more paper before our discussion. David Freidenreich is the Pulver Family Professor of Jewish Studies at Colby College, where he serves as chair of the Jewish Studies Department, a member of the Religious Studies Department, and associate director of the Center for Small-Town Jewish Life. He studies how pre-modern Christians, Jews, and Muslims understood one another because many of these ideas continue to shape contemporary attitudes and interactions. David's latest book, Jewish Muslims: How Christians Imagined Islam as the Enemy, examines the ways in which pre-modern Christians used ideas about Jews to think about Muslims. His award-winning first book, Foreigners and Their Food: Constructing Otherness in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic Law, explores attitudes toward adherents of foreign religions expressed in ancient and medieval laws about sharing food. David also researches the history of Jewish life in Maine, and today his talk is called Shifting Poles: The Evolution of Medieval European Rhetoric About Jews and Muslims. Thanks.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. Really grateful to Boston College for hosting us all, and to Jonathan for bringing us together. My remarks are going to draw heavily on material that's found in my book, Jewish Muslims. I'm pitching it and packaging it in a somewhat different way. And I also want to emphasize the focus this afternoon on European Christians as opposed to those within the Islamic world. I think that contrast is going to be especially important as we proceed. For the most part, pre-modern European Christians did not rank religions. Muslims certainly did, following the model established within the Quran itself, and I'm grateful to Dr. Welle for highlighting the ways in which Islamic thinkers are drawing on the Quran to frame the ways in which they see the world. A significant number of Jewish and Christian thinkers active within Islamic societies followed suit. And that's really interesting to me, because European Christians, in contrast, tended to draw upon a discourse of binary opposition exemplified in biblical texts, most emblematically Paul's letter to the Galatians. Christians used rhetoric about them as a foil to define what it truly means to be us. And these Christians frequently emphasized the similarities among the various religious communities that comprise the broad category of them. I love Professor Roggema's us, and them slide. This is us, them, and them. And the result was not a hierarchical taxonomy with shades of gray, but rather a series of discrete black and white contrasts. By noticing how the grounds of comparison shift over time, we can better appreciate the specific interests of Christians who employ one set of polarities rather than another, but they're all polarities. The Apostle Paul made brilliant use of oppositional rhetoric. To cite only a few examples from his letter to the Galatians, Paul describes his rivals and their adherents as cursed, while those who adhere to Paul's teachings are reckoned as righteous. They rely on circumcision and other works of law to achieve salvation, while we rely on faithfulness. They are fleshly, imprisoned, and enslaved, while we're spiritual, free, and heirs to God's promise. There is no middle ground, no ranking beyond the black and white binary. There is, however, an ever-present possibility for any individual to join the dark side with disastrous consequences. This is why Paul is so passionate in his efforts to persuade the members of his Galatian audience to make the right choices by following his teachings rather than those of his rivals. Today, academic scholars emphasize that Paul himself did not condemn Judaism, either in Galatians or elsewhere. Pre-modern Christians, however, interpreted Paul's work quite differently, in part because they understood the term Judaism differently than we do. Already in the late 2nd century, Tertullian regarded Galatians as, quote, Paul's primary letter against Judaism, which Tertullian defines as nothing more or less than the set of beliefs and practices antithetical to proper Christianity. This does not, however, mean that Tertullian and his successors applied Paul's rhetoric solely to Jews. Quite the contrary. Those who spoke on behalf of proper Christianity, however they defined that concept, routinely branded their Christian rivals as Jewish, on the grounds that these rivals purportedly affirm beliefs or practices that the polemicist associates with Judaism. These Christians engaged in the rhetoric of anti-Judaism, which seeks to promote positive characteristics within one's own audience by branding as Jewish those who allegedly possess the opposite characteristics, regardless of how those people self-identify. Pre-modern Christians, in other words, routinely constructed polemical comparisons, those that emphasize similarities between a target group and an already reviled reference group, in this case, Jews, notwithstanding obvious differences between the comparans. Those who engage in polemical comparison, whether through the rhetoric of anti-Judaism or otherwise, seek to reinforce their own teachings with regard to proper beliefs and practices through binary contrast with negative characteristics that the target and reference groups allegedly share. The message, in short, is Don't be like them. Pre-modern Christians often constructed polemical comparisons with Jewish references when they wanted to emphasize the importance of understanding the Bible in a certain way. Those who interpret the Bible differently allegedly interpret it Jewishly and thus, by definition, incorrectly. Canon lawyers regarded the danger of adopting Jewish interpretations of Scripture to be so great that they forbade Christians from sharing with Jews any meal that conforms to a Jewish interpretation of biblical dietary law. Late 12th and early 13th century discussions of this prohibition exemplify a rare ranking of religions. Christians may share meals with pagans and Muslims, but not with Jews, because, as Bernard of Pavia put it, Jews, through the abuse of Scripture and contempt of our food, impugn our faith more than other non-Christians. The hierarchical distinction between Jews and Muslims that Bernard drew, however, quickly collapsed, both in theory and in practice. Huguccio, a late 12th century contemporary of Bernard and an equally influential canonist, asserted that Muslims, quote, Judaize because they are circumcised and distinguish among foods in accordance with Jewish practices. For that reason, Huguccio not only forbade eating with Muslims and Jews alike, but declared more broadly that there ought not be any legal difference between them. In the decades that followed, popes, bishops, and canonists throughout Christian Europe routinely applied Jewry law to Muslims, in some cases on the grounds that Muslims, no less than Jews, purportedly adhere to a literal interpretation of biblical law. Muslims, in other words, become subject to long-standing Jewry law on the theory that they too are Jewish, at least for legal purposes. The tendency among Christian lawyers toward binary oppositions rather than hierarchical rankings had serious consequences. For example, following the forced conversion of Spain's Muslim communities at the turn of the 16th century, Spanish inquisitors often accused former Muslims and their descendants of Judaizing on the grounds that they continued to observe biblical practices. These former Muslims said, if you want to hold us accountable to adhering to the Quran, fine, but why are you holding us accountable for adhering to the Old Testament? That complaint fell on deaf ears. Odradas de Ponte, a lawyer in the early 14th century papal court of Avignon, offers another example of ranking religions that proves on closer inspection to be the exception rather than the rule. The question posed, should a Jew be punished for converting to Islam? No, Odradas declares, in part because any alternative to Judaism is, quote, the path of lesser evil. Odradas supports this hierarchical claim that Judaism is worse than all other faith traditions, with biblical verses that favorably compare even the people of Sodom to the Jews. He also observes that during the Good Friday liturgy of the day, one does not genuflect when praying for Jews as one does when praying for pagans. Most of Odradas' argument in this responsum, however, treats Jews and Muslims as legally equivalent. In his responses to other questions, Odradas, in fact, relies on the legal equivalence of Jews and Muslims to justify his conclusions. When addressing the question of whether princes may legitimately expel Jews and Muslims, for example, Odradas draws exclusively on evidence regarding Jews. He simply presupposes that this evidence is also relevant in the case of Muslims. Jews may be the worst, but Muslims are just like Jews. The definition of Muslims as legally equivalent to Jews is only one example of how European Christians used comparison not to rank religions, but rather to equate them as antithetical to proper Christianity. Another example of this equation is the allegation that Muslims and Jews alike participate in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, at least metaphorically. The image on the slide depicts Gaudenzio Ferrari's Chapel of the Crucifixion, which features several figures whose faces, headgear, weapons, and banners call to mind 16th century Turkish Muslims. Baldric of Bourget, writing in the early 12th century, includes the following lines about the Muslims of Jerusalem in the sermon that he imagines crusaders heard just prior to their conquest of that city. "Rouse yourselves, members of Christ's household. Rouse yourselves, knights and foot soldiers, and forcefully take Christ away from those impious crucifiers. For every time those bad judges, confederates of Herod and Pilate, make sport of and enslave your brothers, they crucify Christ." In other words, the very people that you are about to attack are crucifying Christ today in their behaviors right on the other side of those walls. The portrayal of Muslims as Christ killers enables Christians to glorify those who defeat Muslims in battle. Christians also employed rhetoric of this nature to inspire new military campaigns. The Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Athir, perhaps drawing on first-hand knowledge, reports that after Muslim forces retook Jerusalem in 1187, the city's patriarch aroused fellow Franks to avenge this loss by making a picture of Jesus that, quote, portrayed Christ, peace be upon him, along with an Arab depicting as beating him. They put blood on the portrait of Christ and said to the people, "This is Christ with Muhammad, the prophet of the Muslims, beating him. Muhammad has wounded and slain him." Although literally preposterous, this propaganda builds upon long-standing European rhetoric, equating Muslims with Christ's biblical persecutors, and in so doing, provides powerful religious motivation for Christian warriors to avenge the maltreatment of their God. An early 13th century work of art known as the Beam of the Passion, which originally hung above a Eucharistic altar in or near Catalonia, depicts the villains of the Passion with features that viewers unambiguously associated with contemporary African Muslims. These villains include the Jewish priests to whom Judas betrayed Christ, and their dismissive words appear on the now damaged beam. The artist contrasts these villains with the holy figures who revere Christ on the cross and attend to his body following Christ's death. Eucharistic theory associates these holy figures with the participants in the liturgy that took place beneath this beam. The anachronistic depiction of Christendom's contemporary enemies within biblical passion scenes reinforces the parallel association of contemporary clergy with biblical heroes. The artist encourages his clerical audience not only to identify with those who cared for Christ's body, but also to revile all who doubt that the transubstantiated host is the body of Christ, whether those doubters are Jews, Muslims, or insufficiently faithful Christians. There is no ranking here. One either reveres the Corpus Christi or dismisses its significance. Binary forms of self-identification, however, need not overlap. Early Christians, for example, reinforced their interpretations of Scripture through rhetorical opposition to Jewish foils, and they bolstered their monotheistic convictions through rhetorical opposition to pagan foils. When European Christians encountered Islam, many chose to portray Muslims as pagans, and for that reason, based their depictions of Islam on crude inversions of monotheistic Christian beliefs and practices. Ralph of Caen, for example, claims that the hero Tancred discovered a huge statue inside the Dome of the Rock. Simply because the statue did not bear the insignia of Christ, Tancred concluded that it must depict, quote, the primordial Antichrist, Muhammad the Depraved. Peter Tudebode similarly reports that just prior to the city's conquest, Jerusalem's Muslims responded to a barefoot procession of cross-bearing priests and Muslims by parading an idol of Muhammad held aloft on a stick. The epic Song of Roland, whose title character's battle cry is, "Pagans are wrong and Christians are right," depicts the Muslim foes as worshippers of Muhammad because doing so renders the Muslims as the complete inverse of the Christ-worshipping Franks. These tales reinforce the veneration of Christ by their respective audiences. At the turn of the 12th century, when the works I just mentioned were composed, no Christian would have portrayed Jews as worshippers of a false god. Rhetoricians of that era used Jews as their foils when reinforcing a different set of Christian beliefs and practices. Over the course of the 13th century, however, European Christians increasingly alleged that Jews did not merely misunderstand Christ's significance, but rather knowingly and willfully rejected the true God. In tandem with the emergence of this allegation, artists began depicting Jews as worshippers of Muhammad. A stained glass window in Paris' Sainte-Chapelle, created between 1242 and 1248, depicts the prophet Isaiah reproaching Jews who worship an idol labeled Muhammad. A similar depiction of Jews, this time with an idol of Muhammad that defecates coins, appears in the Hereford Mappa Mundi, created shortly after Jews were expelled from England at the end of the 13th century. The Jews of Brussels, sentenced to mass execution in 1370 on charges of host desecration, supposedly called out to Muhammad as they burned to death. The notion that Jews are inveterate enemies of Christ, who knowingly crucified their God and continue to torture the Corpus Christi, developed for reasons unrelated to Christian ideas about Muslims. Thanks to works like the Song of Roland, however, Muhammad had come to represent the primary or even sole god of Christendom's enemies within the popular Christian imagination. For that reason, late medieval artists and playwrights found it valuable to depict Jews and Muslims alike as worshippers of Muhammad. I have not found any intellectual authors who have gone this route. But once again, we see a tendency toward a binary division of humanity. In this case, between those who revere God, that is Christ, and those who don't. A wide range of English, French, and Italian plays even depict biblical villains as diverse as Herod, Pontius Pilate, and Pharaoh as Muhammad worshippers. Yes, once again, we're back in the land of the preposterous. These 14th and 15th century plays stage a timeless contest between followers of the true God, Christ, and those who follow the false god named Muhammad. Their creators seek to inspire actors and audiences alike to recommit themselves to proper Christian beliefs and practices, lest they too join the dark side of the binary alongside Jews, Muslims, and pagans. I'll conclude my formal remarks by spending a few minutes on Martin Luther's approach to comparison, because Luther exemplifies medieval Christian thought and rhetoric regarding Jews and Muslims, even as he inaugurates some fundamentally new ideas and rhetorical strategies. In 1514, several years before his break with the Roman Catholic Church, Luther delivered a lecture on Psalm 74. This psalm, according to Luther's reading of its literal sense, cries out against, quote, the faithlessness through which ungodly Jewish interpreters corrupt Scripture. At the same time, the psalm speaks allegorically of Turks and Christian heretics, quote, because that which the faithlessness of the Jews did and does to the people of the synagogue, all heretics, and even more so the Turks, did and do to the people of the church. Heretics and Muslims, in other words, are at least as bad as Jews. In fact, Luther declares that Muslims are even worse because they not only persuade people to reject Christ, but allegedly forbid people from even learning about Christ on pain of death. At the lecture's climactic conclusion, however, Luther offers a tropological, which is to say moral, interpretation of the psalm, according to which Christians themselves are, quote, as bad as the Turks, or worse, in the way we profane sacred things. In short, Jews exemplify that which is bad, Turks are at least as bad as Jews, and we Christians are at least as bad as Turks. One could call this an example of ranking religions, But the purpose is clearly rhetorical rather than hierarchical. Here and throughout his work, Luther exemplifies the pre-modern European Christian practice of establishing binary distinctions between right and wrong, and of emphasizing the similarities among those who are wrong so as to cajole Christian audiences to do that which is right. Luther's most famous binary distinction, of course, contrasts works and faith as rival means of attaining salvation. Luther asserted that only members of his evangelical community adhere to Paul's teachings on this subject. According to Luther, no one else is actually Christian or even a worshiper of God. Consider, for example, Luther's 1531 lectures on Galatians. In his opening remarks, Luther declares regarding the principle of salvation by faith alone that, quote, those in the world who do not teach it are either Jews or Turks or papists or sectarians, for between these two kinds of righteousness, the active righteousness of the law and the passive righteousness of Christ, there is no middle ground. The binary distinction is all that matters. And for that reason, Luther explicitly rejects the value of ranking Judaism, Islam, Catholicism, and rival forms of Protestant Christianity. Again, to quote, the Turks perform different works from the papists, and the papists perform different works from the Jews, and so forth. But although some do works that are more splendid, great, and difficult than others, the content remains the same, for they are still works. Paul, Luther insists, condemns whoever teaches that anything beyond the gospel of Christ is necessary to attain salvation, whether he be a papist, a Jew, a Turk, or a sectarian. This rhetoric is shocking because Luther violates widely accepted distinctions. He declares that the well-known differences among these religious groups are irrelevant because they all share the same defining feature, namely Luther disagrees with them. This sort of polemical comparison, however, is commonplace in medieval Christian literature as well, precisely because it draws on the rhetorical model exemplified by Paul himself. What distinguishes Luther's comparison from those of his predecessors is the criterion on which he establishes his binary, the doctrine of salvation by faith alone rather than reverence for Christ, belief in one God, or proper interpretation of Scripture. The poles shifted over time, but the practice of employing binary taxonomies as a means of inspiring audiences to adhere to proper Christianity remained consistent. Given the profound influence of Paul's letters on Christian thought, we should not be surprised that European Christians made consistent use of his approach to the practice of comparison. What perhaps should surprise us, and I'm going to throw this out as a question for discussion rather than an argument, is the fact that a significant number of Christians living in the Islamic world chose to complement or supplement Paul's binary approach with a taxonomical ranking of religions that comes out of the Quran and that is commonly practiced among Muslims of that society. What are the reasons why Christians adopted that approach to thinking about religions when living in an Islamic society, when in the absence of that influence, they don't? Similarly, what are the reasons why Jews living in the Muslim world begin to adopt approaches to taxonomy that are not found either in biblical or classical rabbinic texts? And in what ways did those patterns of thinking that emerged within the Islamic world then shape Jewish thought in Christian Europe as well? But I'll stop here and see what questions you have. Sure.
Thank you so much, David. I want to try two questions on you and see how do you relate to them. The first is with regards to your remarks on the Quran and the kind of taxonomical framework of the Quran. I think there may be a more complex situation over there, that the Quran shifts between a binary framework to some questions. So the opposition between the Mu'minun and the Mushrikun has this binary structure quite boldly. And also many, many cases in which the Mu'minun are kind of contrasted to the Jews and the Christians being a subgroup or a continuation of the Jews. And interestingly, the Quran itself has this complex notion of shifting between the two possibilities of which you very helpfully conveyed, the taxonomical or hierarchical episteme and the binary one. So this is one remark. The other one, I wonder what you think about the possibility that the taxonomies of religion are subspecies of the taxonomies of everything that we find in many medieval authors. I mean, that with regards to almost every question, the way to address a question is to offer a taxonomy of the different possibilities, sometimes to eliminate some of them, to stay only with a definite possibility, and to see the taxonomies of religion not as specifically related to the question of religions, but to a more general framework of addressing questions.
Great, thank you. You're absolutely right to highlight the multiplicity of approaches within the Quran, and they get taken up by Muslims in a variety of different ways. One area that I focused on in my study of food is the ways in which Shi'is were much more likely to adopt a binary approach, relatively speaking, while Sunnis were much more interested in a hierarchical taxonomy. And both could do so because they're both drawing on Quranic sources for authority. What's interesting to me within the European Christian context, in the absence of a taxonomical approach, what do instead? They adopt a binary structure. And to be clear, it's not that European Christians didn't think about taxonomies in general. They certainly did. And there are absolutely European philosophers and theologians who employ a logical system of taxonomies of everything that they then apply to taxonomies of religion in various ways. And the classic taxonomy is, if you're not one of us, you're either a pagan, a heretic, or a Jew, and then Muslims get slotted into one or another of that taxonomic system. The material that I focus on and that I think is much more representative of at least the European Christian tradition is less oriented toward trying to understand everything than it is toward trying to persuade people to believe and act in certain ways. And in the context of that sort of an agenda, European Christians didn't find value in creating hierarchies at all. They were much more interested in using binaries, whether because they found binaries to be more effective or simply because they found binaries to be more traditional and a more customary approach to achieving their goals. And so even as they begin to integrate Muslim exemplars into their rhetoric, they're slotting these Muslims into them rather than something that resembles us.
I think it's fine to ask questions of an individual, but my understanding is it would be really great if we had big questions that multiple people could answer. So, comments? Polemics?
False binary oppositions.
Thank you all so much for these great papers. You all did exactly what I hoped you would do and what I expected you would do. And so, you know, I just, as the organizer of the conference, I just tremendously appreciate that you're bringing to the fore a lot of the issues that have been percolating in my mind as I've been pursuing my own project, which is a book, by the way, entitled Jewish Thinking About Religion in the Islamic Middle Ages. And I'm using that phrase, thinking about, because it's just so extraordinarily unstable. I mean, I feel like we're watching something unfolding in time that doesn't have exactly a set plan. I liked your phrase trial and error a great deal, because I think they're just constantly trying things on to see where they go. I'm constantly struck by the fact that, you know, sometimes I find arguments that are made in the 10th century that get refuted in a certain text, and then the same argument comes back 2 centuries later in a different place as though it were a brand new argument. You know, like ignoring the fact that this had already been something that had been refuted. So I guess what comes out of the panel for me is further thought about certain ideas such as genre, rhetoric, how things can look very different in a legal context or as opposed to a theological context. So I was wondering if you wanted to start by reflecting a little bit on genre of works, what exactly the role of rhetoric is, right? So if I think back to you know, the rabbinic paradigm that divides the world essentially into 2 categories. You have Jews on one side, and then the so-called minim on the other, where you get lumped together Christians, pagans, but also apostate Jews, basically anybody who disagreed with the rabbis who were authoring the Talmud. You know, what exactly is being accomplished by lumping them together? It seems like groups are constantly brought together and then brought asunder again, right? So for one moment, and I think we saw this in Barbara's paper, for one moment, groups can become suddenly aligned in order to malign them in a certain way, and then they can be broken apart for another polemical purpose, and there's always some sort of agenda in the background. So if you could maybe think a little bit more about genre, agenda, and these floating boundaries. And other people can jump in on that conversation also. We can start with you guys.
Someone want to go first?
Yeah.
Barbara, you want to start?
Yeah, I don't know if it's on or not. No.
I think
It is.
Okay, maybe I just talk too softly. Now that you asked this question, I think I'm still going to say the last thing I wanted to say about Manichaeans and the Marcionites and the Bardaisanites, who are featuring very often in these Christian apologetic texts, but also in Islamic texts. And it's all about that they're dualists and that they are therefore mushrikun, and that the Christians are not to be accused of this error of theirs. So I thought this is just a typical polemical point. How do we make this hierarchy, the division between the various types of disbelief, etc. But at the same time, I was wondering, why is this so relevant, and why is it always these 3 groups? So I started to investigate a little bit, and it turns out that there are numerous texts by Muslims, but all kinds of genres, which indicate that it was a strategy for dualists during the, I think, 8th through the 10th century, to pretend that they were Christian, because then they would be counted as Ahl al-Kitab and then be Ahl al-Dhimma. So suddenly, a text which I thought was just purely polemical, theological, takes on a really concrete situation for people in their own lives. Because not only was it tricky if jurists start to kind of go around with crosses and Bibles and everything because they want to be dhimmis, it was problematic for the Christians, because then the accusation like, oh, you're all a bunch of polytheists, became much easier to throw out, no? Because then there was suddenly a whole mixed bag of these strange groups that were dualistic, and they had the fake gospels, etc., etc. So what seems to be a very kind of simple and dry argument by the Christians turns out to actually have a very serious, concrete and legal implication for the life of the mixture of the various communities in Iraq, Iran, etc. So this is where I think a strict division between the theological or the polemical on one side and then the legal on the other side is a bit difficult. Here, at least here, I have one example where I think the polemics also have a real impact on how people do get along or should get along according to those in power. But maybe it's just one tiny example. There could be many cases maybe where this is relevant. I don't know. To look at legal text and theological text as stemming at least from the same community. I don't know.
I don't know if this responds exactly to the question of genre or rhetoric, but I mean, one of the things I was thinking about in Barbara's paper is when I read early Christian Arabic texts, I'm very conscious of the fact that they're living under Muslim rule, and how the Jew can take on a role as such a convenient foil. The arguments that I want to make against the Muslim, I can't make against the Muslim, so I'm going to make them against the Jew as my convenient foil. And I found myself wondering, okay, at what point do we bleed from that very simple kind of transference of argument into a mode where the Christian starts thinking really in Islamic categories of taxonomy? And you sparked that question in me. I don't know how easy it would be to pin down or not, or not pin down, but I would flood through some of the sources you were citing.
Yes, that's interesting, because I found texts that do the opposite, that make long-standing anti-Jewish arguments, but switch the foil to a Muslim, because Christian audiences would find that to be more relevant. Right? It's a lot more impressive if you can best, the advisor to the emir in a philosophical debate than just some, lowly rabbi. Even though it's exactly the same argument that was used against the rabbinic foil just a century or two earlier. I think what a lot of this comes down to, and I think maybe the key question to be thinking about is, Jonathan, we talked about in terms of agenda. I think we have to figure out, as best we can on a case-by-case basis, what is the author trying to accomplish? And once we've got a sense of that, then we can figure out, okay, is this a Jew masquerading as a Muslim masquerading as a Jew, something else entirely? The agenda of taking these dualists and saying, you're not part of our community. I never thought of that before. But once we can identify the agenda, we can identify what it is the polemic is seeking to accomplish, we can better understand the choice of genre, we can better understand the decision to focus on similarity or focus on difference. And what I worry about is sometimes we guess wrong about the agenda because we have insufficient information, and then everything we argue has gone off the rails.
Yeah.
Did anyone want to jump in on this question from around the table before we? Okay, another question? I mean, I have one that's not really fair. and I'd love to hear from Jonathan as well as the three of you. I thought about this when I was hearing Jason's talk, and there was that moment where You talked about, having these pillars for comparison, how well ideally, how well in practice are they followed. And after you laid all that out, you reminded us that doesn't mean that's how it really worked. And you showed us how that didn't work. I've been noticing in recent years, because for a long time I've worked on mostly Jewish Christian things, but ways that Jews and Christians are and are not having productive conversations. And I've noticed in recent years a new kind of 21st century apologetic among scholars. Things like, well, Thomas Aquinas actually really loved Muslims. I mean, I'm sorry. So, and there's a lot of this work, right? The rehabilitation of figures, of Muslim, and the reason I thought of Jonathan is because, of course, the convivencia debates, is where a lot of it began, but it's extended beyond that. And so I wonder, when we approach questions about taxonomy of religious comparison, knowing that the definition of religion as we understand it won't work and we have to come up with something else, do you check yourself? Do you check your conversation partners? Do you have any? Does this resonate at all with what you're seeing out there? And that's a question that I think of a lot. That are we sometimes trying to push our medieval authors to be more contemporary than they can be in yet another new way?
Part of the reason I first got into this stuff is that I was taught by a rabbi, historian of the medieval church, that our fundamental categories for thinking about the religious other were set back then and are still a lot more active in our minds than most of us dare to admit. And so it creates a really interesting problem. The desire to be historically honest about how much antagonism there was in texts from the period, without somehow engaging these texts in a way that reinforces patterns of thinking that people of faith should no longer hold. How do you do that? That's the trick. The rosy picture of convivencia in Spain is not the response. But what replaces it? That's the dilemma as I see it.
I think that in the kind of text where I think I'm reading that these Christians think these wonderful things about Islam, this and that, I don't take it seriously as that, they're glorifying their own convivencia. They have a very concrete goal of achieving somewhat of a convivencia, and therefore I see it as text with a real strategy. So I'm not thinking, did they have a rosy picture of Islam or not? No, I'm just trying to see how this functioned. But it's, as you were just saying, it's extremely hard because we don't know the exact seat simile, of many of these texts. But recently I worked on yet another of one of these Christian Arabic texts that says all these wonderful things about the Quran. And at some point, there's a really Christian interpretation of a verse. And then it said, why won't you just believe this? It's better the living God than the dead prophet. Yeah. And I thought, maybe that it kind of indicates that you're pushing it in a certain direction. It's not like some kind of ironic discussion, trying to find common ground or anything. It's like only our interpretation. And that may all look very wonderful in the end because you become one group, but it is with the goal of preserving the community, I think. But yeah, again, then my reading could also be just not nuanced enough. I don't know. So somebody would have to critique that, I suppose. But, yeah.
I was given a mic, so I guess that means I'm supposed to say something. Yeah, I mean, over the years, I think I've developed kind of a perverse enjoyment of polemical literature. It's become one of my favorite genres, and when people say truly outlandish and horrid things, I find myself taking a kind of delight. I don't know how to explain that exactly, but but I've also learned to take the genre very seriously, and to think I'm trying to hover above the text a little bit and get beyond a lot of the very particular arguments that they're making to ask what category of argument are they making, right? So, so the text that Jason worked with, I'm fascinated by the predominance of doctrine. Why is it that doctrine seems to emerge as the main arena in which arguments are made? But then for other purposes, they might switch to practices and rituals. And I think the author of polemics is always interested in just finding the arena in which they can be most effective, right, to execute that agenda. But then I ask the question, well, what's going on with doctrine versus ritual, right? How are those things coming into balance with each other as new categories of comparison emerge? How much weight are they given? I love looking at shared charges, right? So all three religions say that the other is deeply flawed because of the divisions in their community, as though any of them could claim that there were not divisions in their community. Or they launch the attack that they're guilty of preserving vestiges of idolatry, right? The Christians get blamed for the crucifix, Muslims get blamed for either the idols that were or are still in the Kaaba and the black stone that's certainly still there, and then Jews get maligned for at least their earlier forms of worship that resemble the practices of Egypt. So how is the category of idolatry becoming predominant? So I think that there's something very interesting that we can extract from all of these texts when we read them together. Yeah, I've also noticed how groups can become lumped together for one moment and then separated in another. So even if I talk about Saadia Gaon's text that I talked about earlier, in his chapter on the creation of the world, there's no meaningful distinction between dualists and Trinitarians, right? Because for the purposes of creation, they both ascribe more than one creator, and he doesn't have to address it there. The next chapter of the book on the unity of God, well, that relevance, that difference between dualists and Trinitarians becomes very important in that chapter. And so at the same time, Christians as a whole can be broken apart between Trinitarian Christians and non-Trinitarian Christians. And he says about the non-Trinitarians, I only have to deal with them on the subject of the abrogation of the law. I don't have to deal with them. So, I don't know, I think of, it's like watching a mobile move in some ways, where everything is like always in motion. There's something really kinetic about this field that's just endlessly fascinating. So.
Thank you. And of course, all of these answers are ideal answers. I'm going to ask you, David, if you want to go. But there's also there are some trends in our field where people aren't paying attention to all of these, aren't approaching it in quite the same way. And so I'm wondering if you're bumping up against some of that.
So I'll just say my personal strategy on that is to name the difference and to, so for example, in my book on food, I state straight out in the preface, I proudly practice what my sources preach against. Right? I'm really glad we're all going to be sharing a meal momentarily because that's the way that we get to know one another and learn from and with one another, which is exactly what these pre-modern authors were so worried about. But by naming the fact that we have a set of values that were not shared, in a sense, Jonathan, going back to what you were saying earlier, by naming the ways in which modern conceptions of religion, modern conceptions of identity were not shared by Thomas Aquinas, for example. Right, that helps us to frame the fact that we and our medieval sources are in important ways living in different worlds. And at the same time, to be able to say, well, we're living in the same world because we inherited a lot of their ideas and we may have more in common with them than we'd like to believe, even if sometimes we have less in common with them than we'd like to believe.
Would anybody else like to offer a comment or ask? We have time. We have like 5 minutes if somebody has another question. Or yeah, please.
Thank you all three of you for your wonderful and very insightful presentations. Yeah, I had a question kind of building off of what Dr. Decter was saying about the shifting alliances, as it were. I think in the presentations today, we've seen that Jews tend to get the short end of the stick pretty often. Like it's the Muslims and the Christians who are kind of banding together against them. And I'm just curious, whether in like Jewish polemical literature or in that of the other faiths, if the Jews are kind of taken on board as an ally against one of the other two. Thank you.
I would say the Jews got the short end of the stick today because Professor Rush Fishbane wasn't here to give us their voice. But I think that there are plenty of Jewish sources. I'm thinking of Maimonides at the moment, where he engages in something similar to that kind of triangular relationship. Okay, Jews and Muslims are similar in this respect, so we can both agree on monotheism, and those Christians, they're Trinitarian, they're forget them. But then he'll pivot when it comes to matters of Scripture and say, you can debate with Christians over what the Bible says. Don't even bother raising those debates with Muslims because they'll allege that the text was corrupted. We've got nothing to talk about. And so in that respect, Maimonides will ally with Muslims on point A and with Christians on point B. You'll find other Jewish sources engaged in similar kinds of things, or alternatively, sticking with a classic conception of whatever, there's no difference between the rest of them, it's just Jews and, those other folks, in which case they're intentionally not trying to draw similarities of the sort that, for example, Christians were doing in the Islamic world.
I'm still building out my piece into an article in the future, inshallah. Aside from being generally struck by the Iranic way that Al-Amari portrays each of the religious groups that he treats, I'm particularly struck by I won't say the charity, I'll say the lack of antagonism or lack of polemic with which he treats the Jews. And part of that comes in just a mode of evaluating religions by a result of their ideal rather than what you perceive their reality to be. But one of the other things I've also wondered, other than the question I already raised to Barbara about under whose rule does the author happen to be living, there's also the question of the proximate other and remote other. So I wonder how okay, if I run the numbers, how many Christians did he actually have to deal with, and how many Jews did he have to deal with, and how did that matter in the way that he framed that? And I don't have a pat answer to that yet, but it's going to be part of the calculus going forward.
If I can just take the prerogative of being here and say one more thing. I think it's also because if you're talking about texts that imagine the religious practices of others, you get certain kinds of answers. But if we look at all of the amazing work that's being done by people like Elisheva Baumgarten, the idea of entangled histories, then Jews aren't necessarily getting the short end of the stick in real life. They just happen to be particularly useful, as Jonathan said, even in his opening remarks, as like the base point to think with. And but in real life, we have all different kinds of realities happening.
Yeah, in that respect, I don't think these texts represent social relations. They might want to try to prescribe them in some way, but I don't think they reflect them. And I can perfectly well imagine that one of the authors of these texts of mine who writes in this very silly way, oh, the Jews, they're not even worth talking about. You could just have a completely normal, integrated life in a city somewhere in the Middle East where he deals with Jews every day and has normal relations with them. I honestly have no idea.
Yeah. So hopefully that addresses the question a little bit. Genre, getting back to genre. I think it's 5:15 exactly on my watch.
So there's going to be a reception and dinner here very shortly, so everyone please do it.
And thank you, panelists.
Thank you.